Hello and welcome to this edition of Naturally Scott. It's our 46th episode. I'm pretty excited about that, by the way. We started about 4 months ago. We've had a heck of a run. And our guest today is David Gessner. He's an author. He's also a guest in my book, Why We Love Birds, which I am grateful for, and I'm grateful that he's here today. David did not want to be known as a nature writer. He's going to tell you about that today, but he is. He's written a number of other books, but nature is the thing he's best known for. When I first got into birding, first got into raptors, I devoured a couple of David's books, Return of the Osprey and Soaring with Fidel. Both books about ospreys, both fascinating. Non-birding books, Ultimate Glory, Frisbee Obsession, and My Wild Youth. And David has told me some stories both on and off camera. I think the title is fully justified. He wrote the Book of Flaco about the Eurasian eagle owl that was, stolen or cut loose or freed from the zoo, depending on your position, I guess, and took New York by storm for a year before it tragically died. And then my favorite of David's books is Leave It As It Is, The Journey Through Theodore Roosevelt's American Wilderness. Fascinating book, well-written, great read, and my favorite president, so it's a terrific thing. And I want to give David credit for this because it's important. I have stolen a line from him, which he calls vacation with a purpose, which I think is a really neat thing, not just for writers when we're out researching books, but for all of us having intention, vacation with a purpose. Anyway, you're going to love this hour with David. Please join us, stay with us, learn about David, his background, his books, his passions, and enjoy yourself. Thank you so much. Take care. Hello and welcome to this edition of Naturally Scott. I'm your host, Scott Harris, and we've got a good show for you today. I know I say that every time, but I think it's because I'm fortunate enough to have great guests every time. And David is one of those, as a matter of fact. David Gessner, welcome to the show this morning.
Thank you, Scott. Happy to be here.
Thank you. David is an author, and we're going to talk about his books and his path as an author, and then some non-author stuff from Frisbees and whatnot. David is also a guest in my book, Why We Love Birding. Those of you who listen regularly know that I have a number of the guests from that book on here, and that's where David and I met. And when that book comes out, you're going to be fascinated by his chapter. But today you're going to get a preview of some of the things that we talked about. Now, we're going to open, well, actually, we're not. We're going to open with, before the show started, David and I were talking about Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. And I was up there last week with my lifelong best friend, Frank Sierra, working on a book called American Safaris and doing research on black bears. And David was starting to tell a story about having gone there with his daughter looking for wolves. And I have to share with you, David, I've been up there a dozen different days, probably 4 or 5 trips total. But this past week was the first time I ever got to see the red wolves, which was a nature highlight for me. Did you and your daughter get to see them?
Not only the ones in the pens that were, in the center of the place,
okay.
But we did see a black bear on the side of the road, and, she was wolf obsessed as a 7-year-old. And we actually traveled up to New York to this wolf center and slept outside near, they were caged, but, so everything was wolf, wolf, wolf.
Well, wolves are spectacular, and I had not seen them before this trip. And, for those who don't know, Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, the wolves were reintroduced, I want to say 1987, but I'm close. And this is the only place where they live in the wild, and there are maybe 30 total that live there, and they're spectacular. And I'll actually share a quick story. When my son was a Boy Scout, when he was a kid, we were doing some work at a wildlife rehab place. And they had put a mountain lion and a wolf in the same enclosure. And, you think about a wolf, and they got along fine, by the way. And you think about a wolf, and, you haven't maybe seen one really up close. Well, the first time we went to work there to do some volunteer work and clean out the cages and stuff, I'm a big guy. I'm 6 foot, well over 200 pounds. And I went up to the chain link fence, and there was a wolf on the other side of the pen, and it came over and stood up against the chain link fence and towered over me. Yeah. And I just thought, oh my goodness, I'm trying to imagine this unarmed, 500 years ago with a pack of them. That must have just been astounding. So have you and your daughter made it back up there? Did you ever get to see the red wolves?
No, we never saw them in the wild. I will say we just had a visit. You know, I'm starting an environmental writing Masters of Fine Arts here at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And we just had a month-long visit from a great writer named Erica Berry, whose book Wolfish is, I know I'm supposed to do this at the end, give a book recommendation, but Wolfish is a great book that weaves research, you know, kind of memoir, her own experience, and kind of essay where she talks about danger and the myths of wolves. And it's a beautiful book. So
And does she write, is it timber wolves and gray wolves? And
yes, I mean, it's specifically Pacific Northwest, where they kind of reintroduce themselves coming down from Canada.
Oh, that is spectacular. Well, you know what? We're going to highlight that book now in the podcast. Okay. Say it again, please.
It's called Wolfish by Erica Berry.
All right. We'll throw the cover up on the podcast. And then, David, at the end, you can still pick a different book for the one book that each guest gets to do. So we won't burn that up. And again, for those of you that listen regularly, you'll know that I'm a huge fan of raptors. I'm not even sure, David, and we'll talk about this about you, but I'm not even sure that I fully consider myself a birder anymore. Or maybe I just never really understood it. But as far as being a raptor fanatic, that I am. And I wrote a book called Raptor Quest about all 53 birds here in the lower 48. And the one that I grew most fascinated with was the osprey. And very early on in my research, I discovered a couple of books that were written by David that if I let him, he'll spend the whole hour talking about them. But we'll slow him down and talk about some other stuff. I devoured these books by David. Return of the Osprey and Soaring with Fidel. So, David, do me a favor and just give us the highlights on those books, and then we're going to move on and talk about all kinds of other stuff.
Well, actually, I can get, you know, if I back up a little, it kind of gives you a sense of my career overall, which is in my 20s. I struggled, you know, I graduated from college at 23 in 1983. And it took me 15 years to publish my first book. And mostly what I was doing during that time was working as a carpenter's apprentice, carpenter, bookstore clerk, worked in a homeless shelter, and trying to write fiction. And I wrote 2 or 3 unpublished novels. And as training for what I ended up doing, this was perfect because it forced me to learn how to create scenes and dialogue. But, you know, I didn't realize I didn't know any other writers, and I didn't realize at the time that what I was doing was undergoing an apprenticeship, you know, and learning about writing. So when I finally, you know, went to grad school in Colorado for writing, I turned around and wrote a book about loving Cape Cod and my father dying of lung cancer at the young age of 56. And I was living in thank you. And I was in Colorado living with my wife, but we went back to Cape Cod to promote the book. And I instantly turned around and wrote a book about loving Colorado from Cape Cod, which kind of set the precedent for my geographic uncertainty throughout my career. But those books were both reviewed as nature books, and it was like, what a fine nature writer. And this irked me to the extent, I just felt caged in by that, right, by being a nature writer. So I wrote an essay called Sick of Nature, which I saw as my declaration of independence from the nature genre. And an editor in New York read it, and there were bird descriptions in there. And she said, oh, I like your essay, but I really like the bird descriptions. And she asked me to do a book about birds. And I was like, damn it, I'll be trapped forever as nature boy after this. But she's offering me something I'd never had before, an advance, a pretty small advance, but enough to quit my job. And I said, well, I'm not going to write about semi-palmated plovers or robins or, you know, sparrows. But I remembered that as a kid, there'd been no ospreys on Cape Cod because they'd been wiped out by DDT. And now I was back with my wife as an adult. We moved back to promote the book. We stayed there for 6 years, and ospreys were everywhere. So I said to her, I'll do the book. I'll write about ospreys, big, athletic, you know, as you know, spectacular birds diving for fish. So she got me the advance. I bought a Spacemaster Bushnell telescope I went out to 4 different spots and I started watching the birds, and it was a whole change in my life. I had a mentor named Alan Poole who literally written the book on ospreys. And Alan said, you've got to learn.
I have his book in between your 2 Osprey books on my raptor shelf.
Perfect. Because he was kind of my Obi-Wan Kenobi of osprey land. And he said, you've got to learn to live on osprey time. So out I went, a novice. You said you don't define yourself as a birder. I was just, I couldn't tell a gull from an osprey when I started. But gradually, I was checking in on these 4 nests, and I hadn't seen an osprey dive yet, which was crazy. But in the course of the next few months, I watched them as they rebuilt their nests. I watched them give birth to these little reptilian creatures. I watched the female rip into the fish that the male had brought, and then delicately place it in the maw of the nestling. And I love that marriage of the savage and the delicate. And I got wrapped up in everything osprey. I mean, I was walking back in June at one point. I was walking actually to the nest, and someone was walking back and their eyes were all lit up. And I was like, I wanted to say, have you found ospreys too? It was this kind of religious fervor. And at night I was reading about ospreys. So I was reading about the comeback from DDT on Long Island, and it really changed my writing life. First of all, I learned the value of obsession, right? But second of all, I couldn't start the book until they left. And I had this big journal. I actually have it right here. This is from that year, and I had it out there with the telescope, and I had a lawn chair, and I would just watch and get all these physical details down. But the book was growing and growing inside me and pressing against me. But I was forced to be patient because I knew I wanted to wait and have the whole year behind me. And meanwhile, I'm like learning, now I'm seeing dives. Now I'm learning about them. And at one point late in the summer, I went up to a fish market and I got some pliers, and I was on the back deck ripping the fish apart to see what it felt like. And my wife came out and just kind of rolled her eyes and was just, she says when she tells the story that I was wearing a loincloth, but I'm pretty sure I don't own a loincloth that was a bathing suit. But, but she saw me and she's like, you're not actually an osprey, enough is enough. So the year,
and didn't she use the word obsessed that day?
I believe she did. And obsessed is a good word for any writer,
I think you told me once before that she said, honey, you're becoming obsessed with the osprey.
Well, I think that, one thing that like an academic, for instance, might become obsessed with Samuel Johnson in the late 1700s and spend his life writing about that. We're kind of serial obsessors in my profession, writers. You go from Teddy Roosevelt to ospreys to ultimate frisbee. And when you're in them, and that year really taught me that, you're focused in completely on that thing. So when the ospreys finally flew south in September, it was like a starting gun went off. And I sat down at my desk as fall was coming in on Cape Cod, and I blasted that sucker out in a month, the draft of the book. And I, didn't sleep a lot. Of course, I went back and revised it and, worked with my editor. But really the thrust of the book came out in a month. And I think that came, I say of the osprey, the pre-dive patience when it's hovering, 50 feet above the sea is as important as the aggression of the dive itself. Those two things go together, right? And, the osprey dive is kind of the climax of the book in a way, because they go hurtling down head first and pop a wheelie at the last second, go in talons first, lift off with a great thrust, shake themselves off like a wet dog and fly off. And, that was attractive to me. And weirdly, another thing that was attractive to me is the fact that ospreys are great slobs. Like their nests are these, often where I live, they're often on top of a human platform. It's like half avian, half human architecture, but they're giant and they've got, Easter tinsel in there and rope and plastic bags. And on one of the nests I watched, there was a naked Barbie doll jammed in there. So I felt a great kinship. My dad used to call me Dirty Dave. So I like that. So that's like, the book is an attempt to sum up where I thought if I just write a factual Osprey book, I'm going to bore my readers to death. So I need a plot. And the plot is basically making myself a character, keeping myself kind of at arm's length, and having me get more and more into it. And hopefully, if it works, the reader also gets into it.
And are you still drawn to the Osprey, Dave?
I am. I mean, one of the weirdest things that ended up happening, which I think I write about in Soaring with Fidel, was the book kind of ended on a Wendell Berry-esque note where it was like, Wendell Berry, like many nature writers like Thoreau, finds one place on earth and commits to it, like marries that place. He uses that metaphor. And I end Return of the Osprey kind of feeling like I've found my place. It's Cape Cod. But what happened was right after that, my wife got pregnant, and readers who were professors down here at University of North Carolina, Wilmington, read it, invited me down for an interview, offered me a job as a professor. So by writing about how I wanted to find home and stay home, I ended up 1,000 miles away. But the irony or the joke of it was the mascot here is the osprey at this school. So 2 months after getting here, some frat boys had hacksawed off this osprey statue in front of one of the dorms and had it in their dorm and were caught. And I don't know what happened to the kids.
What were the odds of that?
Yeah. And so they had a ceremony where they re-welded the osprey, and they invited me to come read from Return of the Osprey for the ceremony. So it just kept going. And as you know, in Soaring with Fidel, having written about the home part of the year, when they nest in the north, I then followed them to Cuba and Venezuela for the winter part of the year when they go to South America.
Yeah, thank you for the books and for the commitment to the Osprey, and for helping me with my journey, by the way. Those books were pivotal for me. And, as I sit here, I've described to you before, as I sit here in my office, I can look out over Lake Greenwood, and from March to September, I can watch the Osprey dive right into the cove, right out at our dock.
Yeah,
and it is
fantastic.
It is high. Now, you have to describe for the readers, and again, we're going to move on to non-birding books. But
right.
before I let you go, you have to describe to the readers your passion for northern gannets and the day that you waded out into the ocean, because I love that story.
Well, for me, you said you can sit there and watch ospreys. For me, when I wrote the books on Cape Cod, we were dog sitting and house sitting in a house facing Cape Cod Bay. And from my desk, I could see, one day I saw splashes and I was like, oh my God, northern gannets are going down, I thought, but also something was spraying up. And it was humpback whales coming up as the gannets were diving down. And I was like, okay, well, this is a red letter day for sure. But then when I moved down to North Carolina, I was surprised to see them here. I hadn't yet figured out the obvious migration, but it was the water being warmer than it was on Cape Cod. I decided to swim out, and there were hundreds of gannets like diving down. If you've seen them, they're like living lawn darts, and it's almost like they're pulled like magnetic, they're hitting and I was like, what would it be like to be below there? I wondered. And then I thought, oh, I will find out. And I breaststroked out, and I was looking up as they were coming down and thinking, well, I hope one doesn't hit me with those bills. But it was spectacular.
Well, you wouldn't be telling the story if they had.
Yes, exactly. So, that's a large part of what I try to do as a writer is immersion kind of journalism, or immersion essays, I guess. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's important. It's the book I'm writing now, American Safari Zoos Without Fences. I'm writing about 31 places in the country where if you go at the right time of year to the exact right location, you're virtually guaranteed to see X animal. Elephant seals on the beach in San Simeon, California, or black bears, we talked about Alligator River, or osprey at Sebastian Inlet down in Florida, right?
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
One of the things that I was explaining to my publisher is I have to go visit every one of these places. I have to go, and if I can, multiple times, because to your point, that's how you can write about it.
Yeah.
Anybody can look the crap up on Wikipedia and Chat GPT and and write a chapter, and I imagine as factually accurate as mine, but it's being there. We were talking earlier about having a 500-pound black bear roll towards you,
Right.
or a northern gannet dive within a few feet of you in the water. That brings, I think, a whole nother awareness to your writing.
Yeah.
And it shows in your books. The fact that you tore a fish apart with pliers, well, I think it might lend itself towards some sort of psychiatric care.
Both. Yeah. My favorite review of Soaring with Fidel was like Hunter Thompson gone birding, and I was like, not exactly. I had a few beers. I wasn't doing acid while I was looking at ospreys. Just another person's name to mention. You may know Mark Smith's photos on ospreys.
I spent a couple of days with Mark. I've got his book, and
Mark just came to. I just invited him up here to UNCW in Wilmington, and we did a talk in a theater that was one of my favorite talks because he, it was big screen. I walked in and just did usually, as you can tell, I like to talk rather than read. But I came in and did a cold open where I read the description of the dive while his dives were playing behind me on the screen.
Oh.
And, and people who haven't seen him should look up, Mark Smith photography as well.
I'll throw the cover of his book up here as well. His photography is magnificent. I spent a couple of days with him. That's how I was introduced to Sebastian.
Down there, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, at Sebastian Inlet, which is north of Vero Beach, and was introduced by Mark. It was an expensive morning because I had bought the Sony camera that he had recommended, thinking that if I had the camera, I could certainly take the same quality pictures. And when I got there that day, I went down with my uncle, and if you're watching Bert, you were there. And Mark said, "Oh, goodness, yeah, that was a few months ago. They've come up with a new one." And I said, "Well, I'm not buying a new camera because I want to stay married." But by lunch, we'd gone online to B&H Photo and had bought the new Sony, and
oh, wow.
And off we went. So it was a slow drive back because I figured out how to explain to my wife that additional expense.
Give the other one as a Christmas present to a nephew or something.
Exactly. All right. Yeah. So let's talk about some of your other books, David.
Okay.
I love the titles of your books. Well, we're going to talk about those. And I'm not doing this in any particular order, but I do want to start with your first two books. As you mentioned, you settled into Colorado and wrote about Cape Cod, and then you went back to Cape Cod and wrote about Colorado. And
exactly.
I think that really highlights your entire career. That's an example.
A lot of confusion.
But talk about those two books. What are the titles and what did you write about?
Well, my first book is called A Wild Rank Place. That is a quote from Thoreau about Cape Cod in the off season. And it is a wild rank place and there is no flattery in it. First, that went with, jive with my sense of the Cape in the off season when you're only 100 miles from Boston, but you can have, back then, particularly when I started to go there, you could feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, even though you're so close to, to a big city. And as I mentioned, you could see humpback whales and gannets diving, right? So that was part of what the title came from. But the other part was the no flattery in it. The book was really about my dad, who was a tough, no-nonsense businessman from Worcester, Massachusetts. And that also reminded me of his voice. He was, before it was corrupted by our current president, I used to love the phrase, no more bullshit. And that was my dad. And, and he also was a little skeptical about his firstborn son deciding to become an artist/writer because his son, as he liked to famously say, didn't live in the real world. I'm not a big, if somebody's sitting up there on heaven can look down at you kind of person. And it is sad for me that he never saw me. My first book was about his death, so he never saw that. But, it's a kind of warts and all tribute to him. He was a tough guy. He was a complicated guy, but he was a good man. So that, as I said, was written mostly in Colorado with visits to Cape Cod and visits to him while he was dying.
Would he have liked the book?
Yeah, because it was, my voice, which later, it's gone through shifts throughout my career. Like the beginning of Osprey is very lyric, and there's some lyricism in Wild Rank Place, but there's also, really simple, blunt lines, and that's consciously, him. I think with my writing, and my mom was very circumlocuitous, liked to tell these winding stories. And my dad was blunt. It was like a duet between I don't know, a piccolo and a bass drum or something, and so I try to, part of what I try to do with humor, and I say try, it's more natural than that, is to go from those long-winded to boom, like short. And so there's a lot of boom in Wild Rank Place. And Under the Devil's Thumb, it's in some ways, it's the one I feel is my youngest book, because I felt like I make, and I do this in a lot of books. I'm involved in the natural world, but I'm consciously using myself as a conduit. I don't want it to slip over into narcissism just because I'm in it. It doesn't make it interesting. It's if I'm in it, it's for a purpose. And I feel like that. My old professor said, "Oh, you should have called this book Booze, Broads, and Bravery." he said somewhat mockingly. So there's a little too much of me. I was coming back from cancer, and I'm like climbing mountains and skiing up things and doing all this, but it's fun. And then Return of the Osprey came next. And then, of course, to counterbalance all that, I wrote Sick of Nature, which was just like, all right, I could do other stuff, and I think that's we're all different, but I think there's a dislike of being labeled and being told this is what you are. And that kind of came out of that. And also, of course, later on, Ultimate Glory was a memoir of my years playing Ultimate Frisbee, which in their own ways was as wild as anything else as following animals or birds. So,
and by the way, the full title there is Ultimate Glory, Frisbee, Obsession, and My Wild Youth.
yes.
So, we're noticing a trend here. You don't want to be a nature writer, but the word obsession comes up a lot in discussions with and about you.
However, it's kind of professional obsession. It's like recognizing that trait in my personality. You could, like for instance, my brother, who suffers from, either bipolar or probably more on the schizophrenic end, his obsession is this one thing that happened, and then you're never escaping from that. For me, it's like I'm trying on different hats at times. I'm like, I know I have that tendency, so I go like, let's turn the fire hose in this direction and see what happens, basically. So yeah, and with Ultimate, one of the, well, first of all, when I did a reading from Return of the Osprey, a student perceptively came up and said, I don't think this book is just about ospreys. I think it's about writing. I think that's the real obsession here, is words. And with Ultimate, there was a period when I wasn't publishing at all, and I really didn't have a job that could help define me. And where if I hadn't had Ultimate Frisbee, where I, played on national caliber teams and strove to win the national championship and trained all year and had these teammates, still good friends with two different teams, one in Colorado, one in Boston. That was my support during those years of apprenticeship trying to write. But it also was a metaphor for the writing itself, because there's, if for people who know Ultimate, it's like stepping into a game of Dungeons and Dragons. There are villains and heroes, and there's an annual quest to win it all. And it was a blast, but it also was very like writing. Like winning nationals was like publishing a book. So metaphorically, the irony of that book is I never do win it all. But the moment where the first book comes in the mail is really the ultimate glory, pun intended, in the book. So yeah, obsession is a big tool almost for me.
But I think it's a tremendously valuable tool. I hope it's good naturedly, but my family and friends have laughed about my quote unquote obsessions over my life. But when I jump into something, it is with both feet. And it really, I never got into Ultimate Frisbee, but I could have. You
Yeah.
know, I was in a blues band for 5 years, horrific. And I think it's a requirement for every old fat white guy to be in a blues band at some point. I don't, so I checked off that box. But I mean, when I collected Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie or,
Right.
my
Right.
quest to see all 63 national parks, of which I'm 57 into, by the way.
Very nice. Very
And you know
nice.
what? I'd be done if they didn't keep adding them. When I started, there were only 51. And
Well, soon
um,
they'll be subtracting them, so you'll be.
if we can get through the next 3 years with still having 63 and not having sold them, I'll be thrilled.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, you're right. I mean, on the other hand, I've found, one of the things I do as a professor and, writing teacher, where I try to help not just my students, but sometimes my colleagues on the hallway, is I have found that sports and what it requires to practice the sport at a high level is hugely important to my writing. And also is a counterbalance, just the knowledge of how important momentum is, daily practice. I write every day, early in the morning, and I feel like there's a superpower attached to doing it every day, like Christmas,
mhm.
and keeping the momentum going. But also in my life, in terms of balance, um, working out is such a beautiful way to get out of that writing mode and to counterbalance the writing mode. And also, again, metaphorically, it's very similar. I mean, you got to roll that boulder up the hill every day to be a writer.
So life is a series of Sisyphus types trails. Is that?
Yeah, but fun, but Sisyphus having fun. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, you'll can have writers on, and some are going to say, "Oh, I hate writing, but that's what I do, and I love writing." I'm on the love writing camp. I find, I mean, the problem solving aspect of it is one of the few things that fully absorbs my brain. Like I get up in the morning, you've slept on it, it's working subconsciously, and now boom, you start to go. And that period, which for me is from about 6 till 9, 6 till 10 in the morning, is my favorite part of the day. And, so I love it.
Do you have a Do you have a set idea of what you're going to write each morning when you sit down at the keyboard?
Uh, yes and no. If, like, for instance, I'm about to find out if this book I'm working on sells. If it sells, it's going to be like that starting gun I mentioned during Osprey. And I know there's an urgency to getting the book out because it's timely. I can talk about it a little later if you want, but
You can talk about
um,
it now.
yeah, well, I mean, it's a little bit of
You
a
mean a little
long,
later in a different podcast, not a little
well, I
later.
mean, it's a tangent that will eat up time. So I won't do it right now, but it's like, if that happens, boom, I'm working on a revision of that book, and that's what I'm doing every day. But there are definitely times where I go to sleep not knowing exactly, and I kind of let the subconscious decide, what do triage during the night and decide what the priority is. So it's a combo, and
You
I'm a
know,
big list maker, but I'm also a big thrower outer of lists.
so I am a big list maker, and I can't throw them out until I've checked them off. So,
Yeah,
again, somebody could write a book about that, I suppose. But, I've mentioned to you before, I published 50 something books. And a half
not
dozen of them have
bad.
been self-published. And the rest of them, my publisher we have a really neat system. I write the book, the first draft. You talk about revisions. I don't revise. I send it to him. I give them carte blanche. They make their changes and publish it, and I never read it again. But today, the book that you're a part of, Why We Love Birds, which I have finished and sent off, and in my mind is done. But today, I'm getting the edits back from the publisher. I've never had that before. This is going to be a first for me. And so I was texting with him yesterday saying, well, I'm not sure what to expect. He goes, well, I love the book. I love what you did. The changes aren't major, but I don't know what changes aren't major mean to him. And so
Well, yeah.
I'm anxious about that showing up today and
Right.
find what that means.
Well, I would say that, having received many an editorial letter where the first 3 or 4 paragraphs are full of praise, and then comes the however, which is the turn. You know, For instance, I think my editor for the Ultimate Glory book said, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. However, there are too many examples of male self-destruction, of you like jumping out of windows or, and can you cut out a couple of those? I find that when you get those first, especially when you first get those, my first books, you're just enraged or upset, and you're like, oh, they're changing my language, which you don't have a problem with because you let them do it without you even seeing it. And then you let it settle for 2 or 3 days, and suddenly I've never had one that hasn't helped the book before.
Well, I hope that's the case. And it's a major New York publisher. I assume they know what they're doing. And
yes.
And you're right. I anticipate that my initial reaction would be, this is Pulitzer Prize winning, brilliant. Every single one of the 90,000 words is genius. I can't imagine that you need to do anything except type OK on the cover and send it to press.
Well, I'm really I'm happy. I'm happy for you. I think that's going to be that's going to be good.
Well, you've read your chapter. I mean, each of my guests has seen their chapter.
Right.
So none of them should be surprised, but maybe the editor is. Anyway, your books are far more important for us to discuss. The Book of Flaco. Tell us about that. That was a revelation for the country when that owl escaped or was freed or whatever. But tell us about it.
A couple of years ago, Flaco, Eurasian eagle owl, who'd spent the first dozen years of his life in zoos, the last. Well, he was born actually in North Carolina, where I live, but he was transferred to the the Central Park Zoo. And one night in February, or was it January? It was January. I'm sorry. I'm on to talk about obsession. I'm on to the next book, right? Some vandals or heroes, depending on how you define it, cut a hole in his little cage, and the owl, who had never really flown because he was trapped in this small cage, made his way out onto Fifth Avenue in a series of small flights, just learning, made its way down into Central Park, where the next morning, dozens of birders, and the next morning, dozens of reporters watching the dozens of birders started following this bird. This rare bird that we don't have in this, isn't native to the country. The biggest owl, much bigger than a great horned owl. And he became a sensation around New York. And there was a birding controversy that built up around him. The pure birders, who I liken to Ted Knight in Caddyshack, and the populist birders, who were Rodney Dangerfield in Caddyshack, had a clash over following the bird closely or not. And he roamed around, flew around, and made his territory Central Park for 6-7 months. And at the end of summer, took off and started flying through the city, landing on people's windowsills, air conditioners. And there's a famous, I sent you a picture, I think, this morning, but there's a famous story. In October, he lands on Nan Knighton, who's a playwright and poet, lands on her kitchen windowsill, and she walks in, and she's not a birder or anything. She walks in, and suddenly these huge orange eyes are staring in at her. And she stays there for 3 hours, and it's a life-changing experience. Talk about a spark bird, And she gets obsessed with Flaco, so much so that at Thanksgiving, she hears her daughters talk about obsession again, whispering, and she says, "What are you talking about?" And they say, "You sure talk about that bird a lot." So she's kind of embodies this thing that happened all over New York, people getting into this bird. So this continues until Flaco dies in a year later. And there's great mourning, and also the New York Post is blaming the liberals for, romanticizing this bird.
Of course, it's a political issue, right?
And it's reported at first that Flaco flew into a building, which isn't the case. Flaco really had been weakened by eating rats, which was its main diet, and the rat poison got into its system, as did something more strange sounding, which is pigeon herpesvirus, which also weakened it. So it fell from its perch, weakened by that. But the legacy, part of the legacy was that the Flaco law was passed. Now they got it wrong. Flaco did not migrate, fly into a building, but millions of birds do die that way. So they passed this law that government buildings had to have, lights out at night, and that kind of, the bird-proof window squigglies on it. And in some neighborhoods, they outlawed the rat poison because, like DDT with the ospreys, it would seep up.
It's the rodenticide, right?
Rodenticide, exactly.
Yeah.
And rodenticide, as you know, is common not just in cities, but all over the country and found in many raptors. So it was an environmental story. It was this story of urban wildness. It was a story of kind of, it was really a story kind of about our self-conscious Hall of Mirrors internet culture, because this was a bird who, like Lady Di, was harassed to its death by, just cameras clicking all the time, memes and internet. So to me, it was kind of this crazy story where within all this, there was this basic wildness. And I ended up going to Finland to see eagle owls in the wild, and, worried that I'd wasted a lot of money. But I got there and had kind of this owl shaman take me up on what he called Eagle Owl Hill the first day. And we not only saw a huge eagle owl from up close, we watched as it dive bombed a lynx territorially. So it turned into this amazing trip. And, for both Osprey and Flaco, I relied on a favorite quote, the John Muir quote about when you pick up one thing in the universe, you find it hitched to everything else. And that's kind of the amazing thing, that you get into these things and then you're like, suddenly I'd never thought about zoo ethics, for instance. And suddenly I'm reading up about elephants and how in California, mostly they've gotten all the elephants out of the zoo, and they go to the elephant sanctuary in Tennessee. And when an elephant that hasn't seen the other elephant for 6 years gets to the sanctuary, they run together and say hi, basically. So suddenly I'm thinking, like, that was a small cage that Flaco was in. What are the ethics here? And so I just love the way, if you dig into one thing, you hit all these other things.
You really do. And for me, when I started this podcast, it was predominantly birders and birding, but it has quickly morphed into something different and, additional, not necessarily different. And so now I have a large number of conservation and different animals and parks and different things that I'm talking about. And to your point, that is the one thing that is the constant, that none of this stuff operates independently. You can try to save the grizzly bears or the butterflies or build osprey platforms or whatever it is, and they're all interconnected and interrelated. And you can't do any of it without impacting the other, hopefully not negatively. But it is amazing, the different guests and things that I'm learning about. And I find that every single podcast that I do is something. Yesterday, the gentleman that I interviewed was into falconry, which to me is kind of a mid-range between a zoo and wild.
Right.
And like you, I'm a little conflicted about zoos. I had zoos as a client when I owned my marketing company. And I recognize that for people who get out in nature and stuff, well, why, I've seen them in Africa. Why do they have to be trapped in a zoo? Well, not everybody gets to go to Africa. Not everybody gets to go to Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge.
Right. And particularly when you're talking about Central Park and urban kids, this might be their one moment to, encounter. Let me tell you another connective story. I hadn't planned it. This fall was the 25th anniversary, of Return of the Osprey. Actually, that's, as you know, that's Mark Smith's picture on the cover.
Mm-hmm.
And this was certainly not planned, but as you may know, there's another osprey crisis. the basic arc, the reason they're such hopeful birds is they're partly connected to the birth of environmental law, right? Because the Environmental
DDT.
Defense Fund saying sue the bastards, used ospreys as Exhibit A as they fought. But now we've suddenly found Dr. Brian Watts in Virginia at William and Mary has found dropping osprey numbers. And the more we look, the more it's not just Virginia. What starts in Virginia, because the Chesapeake Bay doesn't stay there. So Maryland, Delaware, up to southern Jersey, the numbers dropping in some places back to the bad old days of DDT. But this time the culprit is industrial fishing for menhaden, the small energy-packed fish that is the main thing ospreys eat. Same thing, menhaden disappearing because of industrial fishing and other reasons, climate change, and is affecting, is why stripers are now threatened. It's why bluefish are threatened. So the chain that starts with this bait fish has impacted everything, all the way up. For instance, Virginia's the bad guy in the story. The good guy is New York, that banned this fishing long ago, and also seine fishing. So what that has led to is whale tours off the tip of Manhattan, where you're seeing humpback whales, you're seeing thriving waters because the menhaden are there. It all starts there at the bottom of the food chain. So I just did a trip up the coast and interviewed all these osprey people. So again, threatened. And in a weird twist, and I think this is a strangely hopeful thing in the moment. I don't know if any of your other guests have talked about it. There's a famous alliance embodied in Teddy Roosevelt of the hunters and outdoors people and the environmentalists, right? And that, whether it's meat eaters or, the national hunting societies and Sierra, that alliance has been very powerful, and historically, but also recently. It's one of the reasons that the public lands steal got kicked out of the Big Beautiful Bill. You see it in Louisiana, where you see, the very traditionally conservative hunters and fishermen allying with environmentalists against oil spills and other things. And here, there's this video that's crazy. You see commercial fishermen wearing MAGA hats fighting the same fight that you've got the Sierra Club fighting for, which is trying to ban that industrial fishing. But it's all so interconnected, right? And, they're not, and, they're arguing, well, this is the quota. This is what we take. Well, you can take the quota if the numbers are going down. Because if you destroy menhaden, you've destroyed the whole ecosystem, basically. So, return, once again, threatened, hopefully having the example of DDT. Obviously, we're in much darker times, but we can do the right thing again.
Well, and it sounds like, there is a solution. A number of the things you were talking earlier about, the birds crashing into buildings, and we've lost, 1/3 of the birds in this country in the last 50 years.
Yes.
But it's not a single solution like DDT was. You've got buildings, you've got feral cats, you've got cars, you've got habitat loss, you've got climate change. And so here, if there is something where we can go in and say, look, let's restrict this, and we can keep this from happening. And you'd like to think that saner heads would prevail, but there's not a tremendous amount of evidence for that.
But in this case, some of the less sane heads are allies, so that's good.
Well,
it is. I mean, the larger problem, is the timing of the year the clock of the year being totally broken, in terms of these. I mean, I don't think most people think about the millions, billions of years it took to make this whole thing work. For a bird to land at a place where the snails are coming out at right that moment, or the horseshoe crabs, and then the next stop to be, everything is so beautifully timed, and the timing's going bad. But let's not go down too far down that dark hole.
Well,
we've got enough darkness.
We don't have time on this particular show. although it is something that's important and does need to be covered. But that being said, I did tease the audience by mentioning titles of your books. So here's what I want to do out of respect to time, because we've only got about 10 minutes left. I want to talk about Leave It As It Is. So I've read a number of your books, not all, but I have read a number. That is by far my favorite, even as much as I love the Osprey books, because I think that book is important. And so I do want to talk about it. But I want to race through a couple of these other titles. If you want to stop for 30 seconds and highlight them, great. Otherwise, we'll just let the audience hear the titles. Quiet Desperation, Savage Descent.
Delight.
I'm sorry. Oh, you know what? I can't read my own handwriting.
Yeah.
Savage Delight. Fair enough. Which I imagine is a book that could be written about any of 1,000 different things based on that title.
But it's about Thoreau.
Okay, perfect.
That's his quote.
That would be my next one of yours to read, by the way. The Prophet of Dry Hill.
John Hay moved to Cape Cod. John Hay's grandfather was the Secretary of State. Actually, it was called Secretary of War then, under Teddy Roosevelt. His grandfather had also been with Lincoln as his assistant when Lincoln died. John Hay, after World War II, moves to Cape Cod in the 1950s, buys 100 acres for $15 an acre, settles there, and finds that he knows nothing about nature, and just thinks that a mourning dove is an owl. But then over the next 40 years, learns everything about the place that he can, and it's he writes these beautiful books that should be better known today.
Well, maybe they will be after today.
Okay.
The Parball Chronicles.
During the summer of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, a friend of mine here said, "You should be down in the Gulf. You should be writing about this." 2 days later, I got in the station wagon and drove down there. And luckily, the National Resource Defense Council had a building, and they put me up as a reporter. So I spent the summer, in the Gulf. People said, "Oh, no one's going to talk to you." Everybody was willing to tell their stories. And I mentioned the alliance between conservative and liberal. Well, my main character in that is a guy named Ryan Lambert, who was a big old fishing and hunting guide whose lodge was empty because of the tar everywhere and the oil everywhere. And we became strange allies, in that case. And he would tease me and call Obama "your president," but despite our conflicts, we had something in common, and that was the land and the water. So
maybe that can bring us all back together.
I doubt
it. Which might lead to your next time. My Green Manifesto.
Yeah, that was fun. That was kind of my punk rock nature book, where I just wrote really, the spine of it was my friend Dan Driscoll, who worked for the what's it called now? What's the Boston Nature? I don't know, but he worked putting in bike paths along the Charles River. But what he was really doing was Trojan horsing in native plantings. Like, he was putting in bike paths because people would accept it, but he was re-greening the very industrial Charles. Now, I knew him from Ultimate Frisbee, where we called him Danimal. And Dan and I got in his old canoe and went the length of the Charles River, smashed it up a bunch. It was leaking, drinking beers, everything. Stopped one night at a steakhouse and tied our canoe up on, but in the course of that, I write about kind of a manifesto for a less pristine wilderness, like an urban wild, a wild that's more limited but still there. That we can have wildness even in our more regular urban lives.
Which hopefully we can. And
this is kind of fun. I've never done this before. All right, give me the next one.
All the Wild That Remains.
That's probably the book that keeps going most. I mean, I've got kind of a Cape Cod theme, but this is the West. And in All the Wild That Remains, I set out to follow the ghost of Edward Abbey, the great wild man, writer of Desert Solitaire, and Wallace Stegner, who was the opposite, kind of the dean of Western writing. Mm-hmm. And all these books have kind of a larger superstructure, but they also have a personal theme. And when I wrote that book, I was turning 50. I was becoming chair of our department. I had all this responsibility. You know, I was a dad, you know, of a young daughter, Hadley. And so my question that drove that book was, can I still be a wild man like Abby, but be a responsible, you know, caretaker like Stegner? And so my working title of the book was Properly Wild. I wanted to know if I could be properly wild. And I don't know what I decided. Uncertain.
Well, you know what? You've got time to figure it out, but I love that one. Now, here's an optimistic title, A Traveler's Guide to the End of the World.
Yeah.
How close are we? Because I've got plans.
Yeah, I think we got a little time, but that was, you know, I ended up doing a lot of climate reporting, and I just happened to be in places where things were burning and flooding. And I live in coastal North Carolina, where, you know, we just had Hurricane Florence, and my daughter's high school kind of exemplified that. Her freshman year, I think, Florence, she was out for 3 months. COVID hit sophomore year, another hurricane senior year. You know, it was just like, this is a different world. So I traveled the country asking scientists, what will the world be like when my daughter is my age? At the time, I just turned 60, and I was asking, like, what will the world be like when Hadley is 60? And of course, as you can imagine, they're pretty scary answers. At the same time, I think it's kind of a funny book. So
well, that one I haven't read yet, but I will.
Maybe that should be the next one instead of I don't know, whatever you
All right,
decide.
well, fair enough. You did mention the possibility of writing a book about northern gannets, by the way.
I did.
Following them, I think, from Greenland across.
No, from Newfoundland.
From Newfoundland, okay.
Where they're all on the, you know, on the rocks up there, in the gannet trees.
Okay, as we're painfully drawing to a close, I do have to throw this out, because when I interviewed the 52 people for the Why We Love Birding book, every once in a while somebody would make a statement or say something that really rang with me. And yours was vacation with a purpose. I just want public credit. I love that line.
Well, that came about during
line.
That came out doing the Flaco and then going to Finland. I was teaching a bunch of graduate students and trying to teach them about this sort of writing. And I said, it's so great. You go to these amazing places, but you're not going as a tourist. You're going with a goal, and it, you know, and it really changes the experience. And it makes everything, you're living kind of on a double level. Because, for instance, I saw these Eurasian eagle owls on this island in an old Russian fort. And I was looking up and I saw, you know, waited and waited. I was being super patient. I thought I saw something that was like a log. I wouldn't have waited that long if I wasn't writing about it too. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, you're seeing it and it's exciting, but you're also narrating it in the back of your head. It's like a double consciousness.
And you might not have gone. I mean,
yeah,
I wouldn't have gone. Before the show started, when I was up in North Carolina last week, I worked on 3 different chapters: Tundra swans, black bears, and colonial Spanish mustangs.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's just, and literally it was a vacation. I mean, technically it was work, and thank you to the publisher for the advance, but it had a purpose.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it helped me focus on some of the stuff I was doing. Okay.
I know we don't have time, but I know you want to, I'll just say one thing about the Teddy Roosevelt book.
No, you take a couple minutes on that. That's important.
Okay. So for me, I was in a depression in my 20s when I read the famous, you know, the famous biographies of his youth, right? And Edmund Morris, and then also Mornings on Horseback by
I'm drawing the same blank, but I read
David McCullough.
There you go. One of the great writers.
Yeah. And both of them had the effect on me of being kind of contagious. I read about all these things he was doing, and I managed to shake myself out of a depression. It was really I'm a huge biography fan, and that's the great thing about biography is you can put it to use immediately in your life. And so to me, I wanted to recapture that with this book, which was me traveling around the country with my nephew Noah, who'd never been, west of the Mississippi. So I took him up the East Coast to Roosevelt's house in Oyster Bay. I took him to Harvard, where Roosevelt had gone to college, took him out to the Badlands, took him out west to the Grand Canyon, all that.
And Yellowstone.
Yellowstone, yeah. And while I was doing that, I wanted to kind of recreate kind of some of that energy that I'd experienced in the earlier books. But I also wanted to bring it into the moment where there's an acknowledgement of Roosevelt's flaws. I did not want to take him down. I did not want to cancel Roosevelt, but I wanted to acknowledge the messiness of all of us, the hypocrisy of all of us. In fact, in a way, it was like a fighting back against the cancel culture. Because, one of the things I stressed, not just in the book, but afterward during talking to people at different Roosevelt organizations, was historical empathy. We think just this comic notion that we would have behaved so differently if we were back in that time, as if, we would bring our current mores and morals with us and have been like, the rare individual.
Yes, we would have stood alone.
Yes. But, and Teddy can certainly be hacked apart at his weakest side, but boy, the excitement and the energy of, just like moving from being an amazing birder who announces that he's seen an early migrant at the cabinet meeting to being, just a huge monologuist, but also a great listener. People said when he was listening, he was so fastened on them, their eyes, who read a book a night. Imagine that with our current illiterate president. He, just this whirlwind and swimming naked in Rock Creek Park while he's president. Get arrested now. And we wouldn't want to see that either. But, but just this, so to me, it was like, it's so exciting to go back into his life and doing it in the context of environmentalism, because of course the title, Leave It As It Is, grew out of the speech he gave at the Grand Canyon, where, his nature has given us this and we can't improve upon it, leave it as it is. And so, but to also bring that together in a kind of confluence with the place that I was most invested in at the time, which was Bears Ears National Monument, which was the first national monument to grow out of the thinking, planning, and efforts of Native Americans. And at the moment I was traveling there, Trump was trying to, reduce Bears Ears and take it back. And so Leave It As It Is was kind of my rallying cry, basically.
It's a great rallying cry. Thank you for the book, by the way. It is a highlight for me. It's on the short list of books that I absolutely love. I do not read a book a night, but I will say that since 1974, when I promised my mother, because I couldn't afford to buy her a Christmas present, I promised her for Christmas that I would read a book a week for the rest of my life. And 50 years later, I have still done that.
Excellent.
And your books have filled a handful of those weeks, by the way.
Good. Well, you have about 7 weeks left, I think, of my books.
To live, or just 7 weeks of your book?
Yeah.
That's
well,
a huge
I don't know.
difference.
Read Traveler's Guide first, and that'll give you a sense of how much time you have left.
There you go. All right. So now, if you would, as we close up, David, what book would you like to recommend? I mean, we already have the Erica Berry book, and so we'll give you 2 whacks at it. What's the book you want to bring up now?
Well, I love Song of the Dodo by David Quammen. It is a thick, exhaustive, brilliant book about the concept of connectivity in a way. It's about, Song of the Dodo, it's about extinction, but it's also about how we fight back against extinction. The basic premise is, conservation biologists looked at islands and kind of, as Quammen writes, islands are where species go to die. It's self-enclosed, limited. But we take that concept and move it over to parks. And parks are islands in a way. So the great thought that conservation biologists have had over the last 40 years is there a way to connect these parks? And now the most optimistic example of that I can think of is the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor, which starts in Yellowstone and moves up to the Yukon. And
Jody Hilty, who runs that organization, was a guest a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, loved, and of course Karsten Huer, who was the past president, died tragically young, but he walked the whole thing in the 90s. So, and what that requires, of course, and Ben Goldfarb, that's another great book. What's Ben's called? It's a simple thing about connectivity. Anyway, somebody can look it up. But, he writes beautifully about wildlife crossings, underpasses, overpasses, and connecting these patches, which, despite the rather dismal environmental prognosis for the planet right now, that is one of the more hopeful things. In fact, Ministry for the Future, another book, kind of ends with, this positive moment in Yellowstone to Yukon where we see animals coming back, rewilding, as you described it. So David Quammen's book goes into the whole history of this, with E.O. Wilson and others, and how the study of kind of bioregionalism leads us to this conclusion that this is a possible way forward.
Well, we'll highlight the book on the show. We'll throw the cover up if you're watching on YouTube. And by the way, if you are watching on YouTube, if you're listening on any of the podcast platforms, Spotify or Apple, thank you for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, the cover will be up there. And I will ask you as a favor to please subscribe to the show. Every time you do, YouTube pushes the show out to a larger audience, which is great. I think David's message is a perfect example of one that we want a lot of people to listen to and watch. And then it allows us to invite more guests in. So please do that. Drop a comment, hit like, whatever you want to do, all the standard stuff if you're on YouTube. And as I do toward the end of every show, I encourage people, just get outside. I mean, that's one of the themes through David's books. They might be self-reflective. They might be, progressive and activist on some level, but most of the books are about getting outside. Yeah. And when you do, by the way, and outside could be anything, your back porch, your backyard, your local park, a national park, an African safari, whatever level and time you want to do. But when you are out there, I ask you, stay safe and stay curious. David, thank you so much for being a part of this. This was exactly what I had anticipated. Fascinating, far too fast, and many, many things uncovered. But it gives me an excuse to beg you to come back later.
Thank you. I'd love to come back.
You got it. Have a great day.